So they were just in the mix. And so at some point, between 1840 and 43, they're getting connected with Millers, and we don't exactly know. Well, there are 9 different portraits of African Americans that have been identified conclusively as being painted by William Matthew Pryor. Okay? To depict, I want you to look at this image, to depict William Lawson as a successful businessman, as you see here, fashionably dressed, holding a lighted cigar, which you might think, wait a second, Adventist Health Message. Well, hold on, that wasn't there yet. And that cigar is a status symbol. Okay, that's a status symbol. Even though it's bad for his health, the wealthy are smoking cigars. So to depict him in this way was a painterly statement that Pryor made that was very intentional. New research shows that William, like his wife, was an active Millerite, and also he was an abolitionist. Okay, so when Electra Havemeyer Webb, who lived 1888 to 1960, acquired these Lawson portraits, both for William and Nancy, in 1959 for the Shelburne Museum, there was documentation that said William was a minister, that he was a reverend, and that he was a prominent abolitionist. And so subsequent research has been done by historians, some of which I've done myself, and we see that he was a used clothes dealer living in Boston. That was his profession. But he also was a Millerite lecturer. He did travel and he did preach the Millerite message. Now, his wife, Nancy, she is dressed very fashionably as well, a colorful, stylish dress. She's holding an open book in her hand, which denotes that she's literate, that she can read and write, and she is radiating with beauty and placidity. And the background shows highlighted drapery over a detailed window revealing a landscape, which was a device that parallels some of Pryor's other highly developed yet middling work in the mid to late 1830s. Now, the significance of this stuff: Pryor signs his name and the date on the front of the canvas. That is a courageous move, my friends, at this time in America, because painting a black person at this time, especially in this way where you're painting them respectable, that's enough to make a lot of white people, just about every white person, very angry. But William Matthew Pryor was unafraid of that. He put his name on the paintings. He didn't do that with all the paintings that he painted. He often didn't sign his work, but he signed both of these portraits with the date. So he was demonstrating that he was unafraid to paint Black Americans as respectable, normal human beings. If you look at artwork of African Americans at this time, they will accentuate features in really racist kinds of ways to make Black people look like they're part animal. Pryor is going against that in a direct kind of statement by painting them in this way. So this is a radical thing to do, and art historians have demonstrated that and talked about that in this way. And so Pryor is known for his radicalness in this work. And so this is significant and something that you should know. Another thing that's fascinating about the Lawsons, specifically Nancy Lawson, is that her maiden name was Foy. Have you ever heard of a Black Millerite named Foy? Ah, yeah. Do you think they're connected? Indeed they are. Okay, so Nancy was born in Valsboro, Maine in 1810 and was the first cousin of William Ellis Foy, okay, who became a well-known Millerite preacher in Maine and Boston. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Foy before. This is not Foy's picture. This is probably, or at least possibly, a photo of his son, Orrin. We have no known photograph or image of William Foy, and this may be his son, but we can't demonstrate that beyond a shadow of a doubt. But William E. Foy, was born in 1818 to Joseph and Elizabeth Foy in Augusta, Maine. He appears to have been the eldest of 3 boys and may have had 1 sister. He was converted to Christianity by this man here, a Free Will Baptist named Silas Curtis, and he is the one who baptizes William Foy at the age of 17 in 1835. At this time, Curtis was the pastor of the Free Will Baptist Church in Augusta, Maine. Something important to know about the Free Will Baptists: the Free Will Baptists are one of the only denominations in America at this time that is against slavery. Every single denomination in America, aside from a few small denominations like the Free Will Baptists, they support slavery all the way up until the middle of the Civil War. So it's a very radical thing for the Free Will Baptists to do this. Now, the Adventists and a few other denominations are going to rise up as anti-slavery churches, okay? But Curtis is a member of one that had pre-existed the Millerite movement that was anti-slavery, one of the very, very few, okay? And so anyhow, Curtis is also actively involved in the anti-slavery movement, not surprising since he's a member of an anti-slavery denomination. By the way, another point that is helpful for you perhaps to contextualize this, you should know that abolitionists were a tiny minority throughout America's history. Throughout the entire antebellum period, that's the years before the American Civil War, the abolitionists never comprised more than about 1 or maybe 2% of the northern population. So they're a tiny, minuscule minority. Just about everybody else supported slavery in some way. Either they actually wanted it to exist and persist, or they said, well, we don't want it in the North, but it can exist in the South. You know, that kind of a thing. No one refused, like just about everybody refused to consider slavery a sin. And so anti-slavery was really rare. Okay? Well, as you know, Foy has visions, right? He has visions that predate the visions of Ellen White. And we know of 2 of them. The contents of 2 of them were published in this tract. It's a very rare tract, but there are a few copies that exist. And this is the Christian experience of William Foy together with 2 visions. But it's possible that he had 2 more. The reason we think he may have had 2 more is because Ellen White said he had 4 visions. Ellen White says that many years later, she either could have misremembered or there were 2 other visions that we don't have documentation for. Well, anyhow, one of those visions, the second vision, was held in this church that you see here, the African Methodist Episcopal Church on May Street on Beacon Hill in Boston, Massachusetts. Okay? Foy will share his vision in this church, which is the Second Methodist Church on Bromfield Street in Boston. It was a white church, okay? But there were some black members who attended there. He was involved in the Millerite movement, of course, but we don't know if Foy ever believed that Christ was coming on October 22, 1844. Only some Millerites ever believed that date was the date Christ would return. Many, very, very many never had that belief at all, okay? Regardless, Foy has these visions, and Ellen White is there, and she witnesses this herself. Okay, so Ellen White will hear William Miller preach in the Casco Street church there in Portland, Maine. And it is probably here that she heard William Foy speak many times. On one occasion, she says, Foy had 4 visions. It was remarkable testimonies that he bore. We also know that Ellen White's father, Robert Harmon, would take Ellen to go to William Foy's home and just visit them in the home. Again, these are very radical things to listen to, if you're white, to listen to a black minister, or especially to go into a black minister's home. This is very radical, friends. And this is a time in America's history where a white person would not want to walk down the same side of the street with a black person. That's how racist they were. They absolutely wouldn't want to do that because people would cry out, amalgamation, amalgamation. And it would be socially disrespectful. They would be shamed in society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for Ellen White and Robert Harmon to do that simple act, it may seem like nothing to us, but it was very radical in the 1830s and 1840s. You have to understand that. Okay, well, this is where William Foy is buried, and we have his some other records for him here. He remains a minister his entire adult life, almost 50 years, and he died in 1893 at the age of 75. Okay, so he lived a very faithful life. Now, how does Millerism spread among black people? It's difficult to say, and it would have happened in a variety of ways, but one of the most interesting things I have found in my research relates to the Millerite headquarters in New York City. Okay, Millerite headquarters were at one point located in this 6-story building that was located at number 124 to 136 Fulton Street. The Millerite address was 126, so it was in this building here, somewhere in this building. And it was in this building between April 1841 and June 1842. Well, Leroy Sunderland, who was a very prominent Methodist abolitionist, as well as Millerite minister, he established the first Second Advent book depot right here, okay? And so this is where everyone in New York City would come to get Millerite literature. But Sunderland, like so many other Adventist booksellers, he didn't just sell Millerite stuff. In Millerite book depots, they would have anti-slavery literature, they would have temperance literature, they would have vegetarian health reform literature, they would have all the radical literature that you wanted out there. And this is where you came to get all of that. So abolitionists and Millerites, often the same people, are often going and ebbing and flowing in the same physical spaces in New York City, in Boston, in Albany, Philadelphia, and many other places. This is just a way that Millerism and anti-slavery were connected literally, physically through space. Okay, so this is not unique for Millerism that we see anti-slavery headquarters and Millerite headquarters being one and the same. That happened in many other places. Right next door at 128 Fulton Street, right next door to Millerite headquarters, that was the headquarters for the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. Okay, and a lot of the officers of that anti-slavery society were also Millerites. Okay, so in October 1841, Nathaniel Southard becomes the editor of the Midnight Cry, one of the most prominent and the most popular Millerite newspaper. Okay, he is good friends with Leroy Sunderland, and they own and operate that space, that book depot we're talking about. And they give two black teenagers, John Rush Dias and Thomas Hamilton, free space in Millerite headquarters to launch a newspaper, a weekly abolitionist newspaper that is printed and published by black abolitionists for black people. It is called the People's Press. Unfortunately, there are no known issues of that newspaper anywhere. So we know very little about it, like who subscribed to it, who read it, and all these kinds of things. I have searched high and low, and I have found some data that is very enlightening. And I suspect that John Rush Dias and Thomas Hamilton were both Millerites, but I cannot prove it. But they were operating their press in the Millerite headquarters, okay? And so throughout the next year, Samuel L. Wood and Robert Hamilton are also going to help produce this paper, two more young black people who will continue on in publishing black papers. This paper, the People's Press, replaces the floundering Colored American, which had been published for years in New York City and was a very successful black newspaper, okay? And so this newspaper, the People's Press, will take over the Colored American's office space at 9 Spruce Street in January 1842. Now these details, they may sound insignificant, but they are significant, and I'll help you understand why. First of all, this press is starting at 126 Fulton. It will move to 9 Spruce Street. Well, guess where Millerites are going to move after they leave 126 Fulton? They also go to 9 Spruce Street. And so this paper will continue to be connected with Millerism, and even after it completely folds, one of those printers is going to become a printer for the Midnight Cry, okay? So he will continue working and publishing in that space with Millerites, and so I am very highly suspicious, and I highly suspect that they were all Millerites themselves. Well, the People's Press probably, whenever a newspaper took over another newspaper, they generally inherited the subscription list, okay, from the previous newspaper, so that you could send your newspaper to all the people that subscribed to the one that you took over from. And so since we have the Colored American, all of the issues of that, we suspect that there were some Millerites who were serving as agents, people spreading the paper, the People's Press paper around. We suspect that some of them were doing that because they were agents for the Colored American. There are 3 of them that we know for sure: William J. Hodges, John W. Lewis, and Elias L. Platt. And so most of the details of this history are lacking. It is evident that the Colored American and People's Press provided networks for the spread of Adventism, specifically to black people, okay? So who are these 3 men? Who are William J. Hodges, John W. Lewis, and Elias L. Platt? Well, let's tell you a little bit about them. William J. Hodges was educated in Norfolk, Virginia. He was a preacher in Princess Anne County, Virginia in the 1820s. He was arrested in the South and convicted for giving free papers to slaves. Now, what does that mean? He was helping slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. He was forging documents that said that they were free so that they could get out of slavery. So he is arrested and convicted. While he is in jail, he will actually escape from jail on April 24, 1829, and he gets all the way to Canada before he was sentenced, prompted by an outburst of hostility that is going to awake in Princess Anne County and Norfolk counties because of the Nat Turner's Rebellion, the most bloody slave revolt in America's history. Hodges is going to be blamed for Nat Turner's Rebellion. This is a major event in American history. And his family will actually receive a lot of abuse, Even though Hodges himself will flee to Canada, his family is going to be beaten, and they'll face almost death from angry slave owners there in the South. In about 1831, that's when Hodges moves to New York City, and he settles there and remains there for the rest of his life. He became a Millerite in the early 1840s. Exactly when, we don't know. But he quits. He was a grocer. He owned a grocery store business, and he is so convicted that he sells his business and he leaves it to become a Millerite minister. And he's a preacher. He serves as a full-time preacher. And himself, like William Foy, in late 1845, he receives visions, and he has many white followers, which really angers the authorities there. And what happens is they will arrest him. They will accuse Hodges of trying to plot a slave revolt in Virginia, echoing back to Nat Turner's rebellion, and they will throw all of his white followers in the insane asylum. That is how serious the authorities were and how racist people were at this time. Well, Hodges will persist. He had been an agent for the Colored American between June 1840 and December 1841. He was also a co-founder of the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, which was right next door to Millerite headquarters in the same building. Okay, he joins the Liberty Party and was on the nominating committee with several other current and future Millerites that selected the presidential and vice presidential candidates for that party for the 1844 election. Now, I'm sure you have no idea what the Liberty Party was. The Liberty Party was a third party. So the two dominant parties at this time were the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. Both of those parties were pro-slavery. The Liberty Party emerges in 1840 because they want only one thing. They want the immediate and total abolition of slavery, and they want equal rights for black people in America. You're familiar with Sierra Leone, you're familiar with Liberia, right? And the American Colonization Society that is wanting to get rid of black people from America, so they ship them over to Africa. The abolitionists absolutely despise colonization. And they said black people should have their rights here in the US. They're born here. And so they should have that right. So this is an abolitionist, like pure radical abolitionist party. And it was filled with Millerites. Between 10 and possibly 25% of this party was composed of Millerites. You have people at the highest level of organization in this political party, all the way down to the common voter. You have people who are Millerites running for office in 1843 and 1844, even though they believe that Christ is coming and they will actually never get to serve. But they believed that if you actually believe Christ is coming soon, you must demonstrate your faith through your actions. And so if you want to be ready to meet Christ, then you should show your radical egalitarian faith. You need to demonstrate that you're not racist right now. Otherwise, you may be damned forever. So they wanted to demonstrate their faith by their actions. And so anyways, Hodges is involved in all this. He's a prominent abolitionist there in New York City. And he's an important Millerite leader, important Millerite minister, but as I mentioned, he was persecuted quite a bit. John W. Lewis was the other person that was connected with the Colored American and very likely the People's Press that was printed and published in the Millerite headquarters. He was a very, very prominent, one of the most prominent abolitionists, in fact. He was a traveling agent for the New Hampshire Anti-Slavery Society and its organ, the Herald of Freedom. He was the traveling agent for the Colored American from January to December 1841. Now, just so you understand the significance of this, you had local agents who would give people their newspapers. I should step back a little bit so you understand this. At this time, newspapers are not delivered to your door. Okay, you don't get them through the mail. Whenever you subscribe to a newspaper, you have to go to the publishing office or to the agent's office to pick it up. And the agent collects the money and they give it to the publisher and all this kind of stuff. So agents are very important. Most agents, though, did not travel. They were stationed in a particular location. But to travel, to be a traveling agent, means that you are one of the most important people for that newspaper because you're trying to gain new subscribers and you're trying to also circulate that paper widely and so forth. And so he is one of the most prominent abolitionists. Serves as a traveling agent for 2 anti-slavery papers. He's also an agent for the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate in 1842. There's another one. He was also an agent for William C. Nell's Adelphic Union Library Association, which was a prominent literary organization for black people in Boston. Okay? And in September 1842, William C. Nell, who may have been a Millerite himself, He wrote to Amos A. Phelps because William Miller's theory was being discussed in the Adelphic Union Library Association, and he wanted evidence to show the errors of date setting, or he wanted to know if Miller was actually right, and wanted to know what the worst arguments against it were. It's unclear. Nell himself, who was a very prominent abolitionist, worships with Adventists many times, and he says he worships as one of the family. So was he a Millerite? Was he an Adventist? We don't know, but it's certainly he was very closely connected with them. Well, John Lewis, in May 1843, a general conference, a Millerite general conference held in Boston, agrees to fund Lewis to preach Adventism to black full-time. So he is actually a officially paid black Adventist minister and starts to circulate and spread Millerism to black communities throughout the North, literally throughout the entire North, at least New England. Okay? Now that third person, Elias L. Platt, that was connected with the People's Press, he ended up becoming a Seventh-day Adventist. So we're going to talk about him, and we're going to transition to the first black Seventh-day Adventist as we do so. So Elias L. Platt, and by the way, this is a picture of his son, William K. Platt. Unfortunately, we have no photograph of Elias or Henrietta Platt, and it's very likely that we don't have a photograph of Elias Platt because he dies in the early 1850s before photographs were really common. So one probably never was taken. Excuse me. Anyways, Elias Leonard Platt was an agent for the Colored American from May 1840 until December 1841. The Underground Railroad agent William Wells Brown stated of Elias Platt that his and Henrietta's house is humanity's home in Steuben County. That is probably a veiled allusion to the fact that he was operating a stop on the Underground Railroad. He lived in Bath in Steuben County. We know that the Underground Railroad went through Bath, and Elias Platt was the most prominent abolitionist there, so undoubtedly he was operating the stop of the Underground Railroad there. He was very good friends with Frederick Douglass. Have you heard of Frederick Douglass? The most famous and well-known abolitionist ever, bar none, I would say. He was an agent for Frederick Douglass's North Star in April 1848. And Douglass considered Platt his, quote, esteemed friend. When Platt unfortunately died in 1854, Frederick Douglass is the one who wrote his obituary. And he said this: "The deceased was a most estimable man, one of the most devoted, honest, persevering friends of his people in the state of New York. No anti-slavery lecturer that ever visited Bath, where this interesting family now reside, was without his sympathy and efficient cooperation." Now, when Frederick Douglass wrote this obituary, Elias Platt was a Seventh-day Adventist. He has the distinction of being probably the only Seventh-day Adventist that Frederick Douglass wrote his obituary for. That is significant. Seventh-day Adventism had taken root in Bath, New York in early 1851. Lebbeus Drew, an early Adventist minister you probably have never heard of, he stated in April of that year, quote, "I was in Bath last Sunday and met with the church there. I think the church in that place will nearly all receive the third angel's message. I felt some of the love and spirit we had before 43. In other words, a reference to the time of Millerism. By the middle of that year, two other Seventh-day Adventist ministers resided there, Israel Alden and George W. Stocking. I'm sure you've never heard of them either. During the summer of 1851, another very prominent early Adventist minister, probably you've still never heard of him though, was Samuel W. Rhodes. And Hiram S. Case, also fairly prominent. They came there with Hiram Edson to hold a Sabbath conference there in Bath. In September then of that year, a few months later, Samuel Rhodes will come with Joseph Bates himself, and they will hold a second Sabbath conference in Bath because things are going so well. Now, before we go, I need to pause for a second to tell you something cool about Elias Platt that you see pictured here. You see that image that says free labor, sugar, and molasses. Elias Platt was a grocer. As an abolitionist, he refused to sell slave labor products. A very radical and difficult thing to do. And he's advertising here in the newspaper that you can buy free labor sugar and molasses that was not harvested and picked by slaves in the store. It's a very radical thing to do. Very difficult economically to do. Anyways, Elias and Henrietta Platt, they become Seventh-day Adventists at some point in 1851, when all of these meetings that we just talked about were happening, at some point there, they're becoming Adventists. In January 23 of 1852, James and Ellen White will now come to Bath, and they will hold a third Sabbath conference there with another prominent white Adventist minister, Joseph Baker. James White will then meet the Platts, and he will write this for all the readers in the review, and he says this: "We formed a happy acquaintance with Brother and Sister Platt, who kindly entertained us much of the time we were in Bath. We were delighted with the order and good behavior of their dear children. We do not design to flatter, but as an orderly family, where children are trained as they should be, is seldom found, we cannot refrain from mentioning this case." That's a very nice thing to say. But one thing I want to point out to you here is he says that they were entertained a large time while they're in Bath in the Platts' home. Remember, again, this is a time when white and black people won't come that close, ever. You don't want to be on the same side of the street. So if you're white, to go in a black person's home, that's dangerous, literally dangerous. Okay, so throughout the year, throughout 1852, the Platts will make several donations to the church, and they'll subscribe to the Review and Herald as well as the Youth's Instructor. Okay, what's really fascinating is that Bath, New York, seems to be the first place where a black Seventh-day Adventist community developed, because the Platts were not alone. The Platts apparently were instrumental in bringing in other black people into the Seventh-day Adventist Church there in Bath. They were related to Edward and Phoebe Ann Dorsey, who lived close to the Platts' home in Bath. By mid-1852, Phoebe Ann Dorsey, and probably her husband Edward, had joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church, along with two sisters and close friends, Eliza A. and Frances A. Cooper. So you've got at least 5 black Adventists, and probably their families as well, in this one little town. Prior to the emancipation of slavery in New York, which came to most black people in 1827, the Dorsey and Cooper families were both owned by the same slave master. So these people all know each other. They're close friends. Okay? The Cooper sisters, we know, also remained Adventists their entire lives. So the really cool thing about this, guys, is now that we have known about these people, we have an unbroken line of black Adventist history from the Millerite period of 1835-ish all the way to the present. That may not seem significant, friends, but we did not know that information 5 years ago. This is really important stuff, I think, even though we don't know a whole lot about them. Well, the Cooper sisters remained Seventh-day Adventists their entire lives. Henrietta Platt falls off the published record. We don't know what happens with her. We don't know if she remains an Adventist or if she leaves or if she died. We don't know. Okay, so beginning in the 1860s, these two families, the Cooper families and so forth, they are going to attend the Wellsville Seventh-day Adventist Church that was founded by the very first black Adventist minister. If you've heard of Charles Kinney has for a long time been called the first black minister. That we know that that's not true anymore. I would still call Kinney the father of black Adventism because he was so prominent. But Ariel Barr predates him. So we should talk about him briefly. We only found out about Ariel Barr in 2015. Adventist historians had known about Barr for years because he was a prominent early Adventist minister, but we always assumed he was white. Now, how could we make such a funny, foolish decision or observation? It's because the Adventist Review and other sources, they never mention the race of people. They just give the name. So the only way to know if someone's white or black is if you can find them in the US Census or some other document that will show their race. And so it wasn't until 2015 that we actually finally found out, to our surprise, that Ariel Barr was black. Well, Ariel Barr is now believed to be the first ordained African-American Seventh-day Adventist minister. He was born in Reading, Vermont, May 23, 1814, and his father was named William Barr. He studied English at Wesleyan Academy in Massachusetts in 1836, and he marries Lori Z. Harvey on December 7, 1842 in Reading, Vermont. Barr became a Millerite, and he was a Millerite minister, and in the early 1850s, he becomes a Seventh-day Adventist. The Whites, James and Ellen, first met Barr in the mountains of Vermont, that is Barr's home region, on September 3, 1852. We actually know the exact date. And it was in Walcott, the town of Walcott, at a meeting under a 400-seat tent that adjoined the house of Seth Hubbell Peck. They're holding a meeting there and bringing people in. Well, James White will write that here he and Ellen, quote, met Brethren Barr and Alfred S. Hutchins for the first time and heard them speak of the present faith, hopes, and joys. May the Lord give them success in winning souls to Christ and the present truth. On the morning of September 30, 1852, Ellen White has a vision in Dorchester, Massachusetts, the contents of which James White will write down in brief to Leonard Hastings in a letter. And one of the takeaways from this vision is this, that, quote, Ellen White says in vision that, quote, Brethren Baker, Ingram, Barr, and Wheeler were men to be dependent upon. Now, you need to understand what's going on at this time. If you know anything, if you're really good with Adventist history, you'll understand that in 1852, at this time, this is when Adventists are just starting to issue credentials to traveling ministers. They're facing a lot of problems with people who are saying, I'm an Adventist, and they're coming and preaching to an Adventist group, and they're misleading them theologically in other ways. And so this vision is trying to help give clarity to the ministerial challenges that they are facing. And Ellen White is showing in vision, we know at least 4 faithful Adventist ministers, and one of them is Barr. That's really significant, friends. We know that Ariel Barr was ordained as well. The historian Douglas Morgan found this at the General Conference Archives. This is a portion of Augustin Cornelius Bordeaux's sustentation file. The sustentation file is the file that the GC keeps on everyone that was living at the time to help talk about how they get their retirement kind of plans and packages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in there, one of the things you're required to do is submit a biographical information sheet. And so it asks questions like, for example, in Augustin C. Bordeaux's case, who is, by the way, a very, very prominent white Adventist minister, they ask questions like, when were you converted? And when were you ordained as a minister? And this white minister, Augustin C. Bordeaux, who was very prominent, guess who ordained him? Ariel Barr. So even though we don't have Ariel Barr's ordination certificate, very few of those survive. They're very rare to keep that. We know he was ordained because he's ordaining other people. Okay? He's ordaining white people at a time when white people don't want to be so close to a black person. This is significant, my friends. Are you getting an idea of how radical the early Adventists were here? Yeah. Barr was one of the most prominent, he was one of the most prominent ministers, bar none. I guess pun not intended. Okay? This man, Ariel Barr, he is the chair of General Conference sessions, not the capital GC after 1863, because he'll die in 1864. He dies early, unfortunately. But there were General Conference meetings, and Barr is chairing those meetings. This is a prominent person. We have known about him for so long. He partners up with every well-known Adventist minister at the time. He preaches with the Whites. He preaches with Joseph Bates. He preaches with all of these prominent people. This is a guy well-connected. The first black Adventist minister. You should get online, by the way. Benjamin Baker has written his biography for the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists. Go on there. It's online and check it out. It's worth reading. You should also, by the way, you need to read Benjamin Baker's article published in the Journal of Church History. It's the first ever piece written on black Millerites ever. And it just got published a little over a year ago, I think. So I can help you find those if you want to read more about this later. But this guy here, I want to emphasize how important Barr is. And I'm only giving you a very brief little bit of his life. So go check out more of it. Now, Barr was not the only black Adventist minister before the Civil War. There was at least one more. Now, this is not the guy we're talking about. Garrett Smith there is obviously white, but John West was black, and his story is connected intimately with Garrett Smith, so I want to talk about both of them. Garrett Smith was a very prominent abolitionist. He becomes a Millerite in 1840 and remains connected with Adventists until his death in the 1870s. In 1849, Garrett Smith will also embrace the Seventh-day Sabbath. Now, you need to understand, Garrett Smith is one of the most prominent abolitionists in America. He's up there with Frederick Douglass. He's up there with William Lloyd Garrison. He is one of the top, and he was probably the most wealthy. He was a land baron in New York State, and if you would equate his wealth from back then in today's dollars, he would have been a multi-billionaire. This is a man who bankrolls literally a tremendous amount of the entire abolitionist movement from Peterborough, New York. And one of the things that he does, because he has so much money, whenever the opportunity arose for him to purchase slaves, he would do so, bring them north, and set them free. And one of the slaves that he purchases this freedom for is John W. West. And so I want to talk with you about him. West is a beloved person in the town of Peterborough. And we now take, and I'm about to in another couple weeks, take another tour group there to see this painting and to talk about Gerrit Smith and talk about John West and see where he's buried. And so this is a painting that's hanging in the National Abolitionist Hall of Fame in Peterborough, New York. And this painting is surrounded and literally created around John W. West. John W. West, we have no picture of him, but the artist is depicting him right here in the front. Right here. Okay? Why is he stooped over like that? He's stooped over like that because John West was a hunchback. He suffered, the medical correct term is kyphosis. We don't know how he got kyphosis. It could have been because he was beaten severely by slave masters. That's a possibility. It also could have been genetic. We just simply don't know. But he was handicapped. But he is shown there. He's at the very front of this painting because the painting is an imagination of an anti-slavery meeting, and John West is the one calling all of the abolitionists here to come together for this meeting. Come join the abolitionists is the name of this painting. Okay? And so this painting is beginning with John West by calling all the people together, and then the story that the artist tells with all the things that are going on includes really famous abolitionists that are going to speak. Gerrit Smith, John Brown of Harper's Ferry fame, and other prominent people that are going to speak and preach here in Peterborough. And the last sermon, and this is an imagined scenario, by the way, but the last sermon is preached by John West himself. And so the artist, who is unfortunately now deceased, really was inspired by John West. And he didn't even know he was a Seventh-day Adventist minister. Well, how does he become a Seventh-day Adventist minister? Well, John West was born in Maryland, okay? And later in life, he is sold down south to New Orleans. And in New Orleans, he becomes a Methodist, and he starts preaching among Methodist slaves there in New Orleans. In 1852, on August 31, Gerrit Smith will purchase his freedom, and he will come to live in Peterborough. And Gerrit Smith gives him, I showed you a picture here, this is Gerrit Smith's mansion. Just about 300 feet away from that mansion, Gerrit Smith gave John West a store where he also lived. Okay, that building no longer stands, and there's no image of it, unfortunately. But Gerrit Smith gave him a place to live on his own land and a business to run so he could take care of himself. And like Elias Platt, John West refused to sell slave labor products. So you could buy free sugar there, you could buy free cotton there, and things like this. Okay? What Gerrit Smith does, what John West does is about a year, a little bit over a year after he lives there, he starts connecting with Seventh-day Adventists. Now, it may be through Gerrit Smith himself. Gerrit Smith is keeping the Seventh-day Sabbath at this point, okay? But in any case, some Adventist ministers are coming there to Peterborough, and West converts. And not long after that, West will gain permission from Gerrit Smith himself and say, I would like to hold Seventh-day Adventist meetings in your church, the Free Church of Peterborough, every Saturday afternoon. And Gerrit Smith tells him, yes, he can do that. And so John West here will do that. He will hold Seventh-day Adventist meetings every Sabbath afternoon in that church. And he's ministering to an entire white congregation, including Gerrit Smith, who will frequently attend. Well, this here is John West's tombstone. It's located there in Peterborough, New York. You can read what it says, I think. It says John West, and then underneath his name it says the Domine. You know what the Domine means? The Domine is Latin for minister. This tombstone itself shows how much he was respected in this community, because he was known. Everyone there called him the Domine out of respect for this man, this handicapped man. And it gives the following information. It says, born a slave, December 25, 1816. died a freeman, December 25, 1868. And then the last thing it says, you can't read it from there, but at the very bottom, there's an inscription that says, deformed in body, but beautiful in spirit.
Wow.
This tombstone was paid for and erected by Gerrit Smith himself. Gerrit Smith is a very close friend of John West until he died. And he is the second Black Adventist minister that we know about. Unlike Barr, John West didn't itinerate far. He didn't travel far, but he was a Black Adventist minister nonetheless. Okay, another Black Adventist family that we know from the early period, we've known about this family a little longer because Ellen White talks about them in her writings, and it's clear that they were African American. So we've known about them for a while, but you should, if you don't know who they are, you should know who they are. This is the Hardy family. They lived in Michigan. Pictured here, the woman is Alice Hardy there on the left. William J. Hardy, the father, is drawn there in the center. And Eugene Hardy, the son, is there on the right. So the father in the middle with a daughter and son beside him. This is how we know about the Hardy family. This comes from Ellen White's diary, okay? And she records this on Tuesday, January 25, 1859. She says this, quote, "It looks like a storm. I feel rather cast down. My teeth troubled me through the night. We rode 14 miles to Brother Hardy's. Brother Kramer did not give us the right directions, and we went 4 miles out of our way. Did not arrive at Brother Hardy's until dinner time. It was snowing fast. We were heartily welcomed by the family. A good dinner was soon in readiness for us, of which we thankfully partook. This is a colored family. Although the house is poor and old, everything is arranged with neatness and exact order. The children are well behaved, intelligent, and interesting. May I yet have a better acquaintance with this dear family. The meeting is 4 miles beyond Brother Hardy's home, or Brother Hardy's. They accompanied us to the meeting. It was held in a private house. Brother Loughborough talked for 30 minutes on the gift of the Spirit of God. Then I spoke of neatness and order." And that's what we know about Ellen White's encounter with the Hardys. I don't know if she ever got a chance to get to know them more or not. But the Hardys were quite prominent people there in Michigan. Again, you can go onto the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists and you can read more about the Hardys. William J. Hardy was one of the earliest educated people in the state of Michigan who was a person of color. And so he's prominent, and people in Michigan as a state are fascinated with Hardy because of his prominence within the state. Okay, I'm going to take a quick drink, and we're going to talk and end with Sojourner Truth. How am I doing on time? We go to 6 or 6:30? 6? We still have some time. Okay, good. Do you guys know who Sojourner Truth was? Very famous in the United States. One of the most famous abolitionists, women's rights activists in American history, period. Okay? She was really closely connected with Adventists in most of her life, or the latter half of it at least. So Sojourner Truth was born under the name Isabella Baumfree. And she had a very difficult life in slavery in New York State. Okay, she was a northern slave. Usually we associate slavery with the South. But Sojourner Truth was enslaved in the North, and she faced a lot of hardship, beatings, and having her family ripped away from her and sold to the South, and all kinds of things that were very common to slavery. She finally escapes, and she liberates herself a year before she was supposed to be emancipated because her owner had said he was going to liberate her earlier, and he reneged on his promise. So she ran away. And so she gained her freedom by running away and living with some abolitionists who would protect her for a period of time. And then about a year later, so a few months later, she legally became free. Well, she lives her life in sort of precarious situations, moving around a lot. She was a Methodist. Until she gets connected with a very radical new religious movement with a very abusive, patriarchal kind of leader named Matthias. So she joined something called the Kingdom of Matthias. Matthias was a white person who believed that he was the incarnate Christ. And she believed him for a period of time, and she lives with him. And she is so loyal to him, even though Matthias will beat her as her slave masters had done before. It's tragic. And we can raise a lot of questions about why would she do that? Well, in any case, Sojourner Truth had a very hard and challenging life in those early years. And eventually she comes to a place of peace. And you know where she found that peace? She found it in the Millerite movement. Isabella Baumfree took the name Sojourner Truth after she became a Millerite. And that's the name that she's known by today. And during her Millerite experience, that is when she started preaching around, and she started to speak out against slavery and for women's rights. So she started the famous career that she has now literally begins with Millerism. It begins with Adventism. Okay? And so in November 1842, a Baptist farmer turned itinerant preacher named William Miller, you know who he is. He preaches again, he'd been there many times, in New York City on the end of the world in 1843. And Isabella, who had not yet taken the name of Sojourner Truth, at the time she lived with Perez Whiting at 72 Canal Street, which was only a little over half a mile away from where the Millerite headquarters were, where they were printing the People's Press, okay? 9 Spruce Street, okay? The second location of that paper, right? Presumably, she was familiar with Adventism even prior to William Miller's visit there, but nevertheless, Isabella Baumfree is there and she hears William Miller preaching. Was she a Millerite before this, or did she become a Millerite through this experience? We don't know, but somewhere about this time, she becomes a Millerite. And though she later claimed she could not understand these enigmatic pictures decorating Miller's prophecy chart, this event permanently changes her life. Okay? So we keep on moving. She's quickly drawn into the Millerite movement, and as I said, she takes the name on June 1, 1843, she takes the name Sojourner Truth. It's the day of Pentecost at the time, a day of significance for her as well as for the Millerites. Okay, the historian Nell Irving Painter, who is a biographer of Sojourner Truth, she says that, quote, Isabella's rebirth in 1843 as Sojourner was a second Adventist reworking of a Methodist style of sanctification. So the historians recognize that this name change is connected with her Millerite experience. Her name indicated her calling as an itinerant preacher, someone who travels and preaches. A sojourner, after all, wanders from home and preaches what they speak, and preachers, of course, speak truth. So the name Sojourner Truth is indicative of her calling as a traveling minister. Furthermore, though, Nell Irving Painter explains this. She says, quote, a sojourner does not have long to stay here in this instance because the world was coming to an end with Jesus' second coming, the second advent. And the little time before Sojourner Truth would be living, in a little time she would be living with Jesus. She was on a pilgrimage, therefore, telling people to come to Jesus while there was still time. That's a really powerful quote from a non-Adventist historian. Truth rose in prominence as a speaker at Adventist camp meetings, and the prospect of Christ's immediate advent led her into her activism. The historian and my good friend Benjamin J. Baker has noted that, quote, Truth operated as a prophet at the camp meetings, rebuking the outlandish carryings-on, comforting those who were terrified of the approaching advent, and confounding white Millerite ministers with their theological sagacity, end quote. The Adventist contemporaries, the Millerite contemporaries, likewise affirmed that white Millerites, quote, listened eagerly to Sojourner and drank in all she said because she was, quote, a great favorite in our meetings. Again, significant. Well, she was a Millerite. She probably leaves. She becomes disconnected with Adventism, at least after the Great Disappointment. Okay? But later, Sojourner Truth, if you did not know this, she will move to Battle Creek, Michigan. Sound familiar? Yeah. And after she moves there, her relationship with Seventh-day Adventists will start to grow increasingly. She moves there to the Battle Creek area in 1857. But in 1875, we really start to see a close relationship and bonds forming even tighter. Early in that year, the Review and Herald publishing house offered to print a new biography of Sojourner Truth. George W. Amidon, this man here, who was a lifelong Adventist printer and a pioneer of our Sabbath school, that we did it today, okay? He was an experienced printer, and he's the one working closely with Sojourner Truth and her agent and friend, Francis Titus, to make this new biography happen. And guess what? The Seventh-day Adventist Church prints and publishes the last 4 editions of Sojourner Truth's autobiography. The first one you see here on the left, it actually bears the name, the publishing location of Boston. But at the Center for Adventist Research where I work, we have the diaries of George Amidon, where we see that he is setting the type. And for this book, we know it was published in Battle Creek, despite the fact that it says Boston. We also see it evidence for that in the advertisements, which will advertise this book for the first time. They will say where it was published. And we have a letter that Sojourner Truth dictates to William Lloyd Garrison, which indicates this as well. So it's quite clear that this first edition of the new edition, if that makes sense, of her autobiography was published by the Adventists. And then the next 3 years were as well. Sojourner Truth is still living in 1878 when the second one comes out, and in 1881 she's still living, but then she dies in 1883. The last edition here, which actually has the name Review and Herald on the publishing page right here, hard to see it, right there, Review and Herald. That is published immediately after Sojourner Truth's death, and it includes, in addition to the autobiography, a narrative of her funeral. Okay, I am now glad to say that we have a copy of each one of these editions at the Center for Adventist Research. They're very hard to come by, but I knew that this was significant enough, and so we paid a little bit to get them. We only had one issue before I was able to buy the other 3. Okay, well, there's a growing relationship, like I said. After 1875, published records indicate that Truth occasionally lectures at the Adventist Church, the Dime Tabernacle there. She lectures at Battle Creek College, now Andrews University, and she lectured in the Battle Creek Sanitarium as well. She was closely associated with Adventists. John R.B. Kellogg was her physician, and she attended the Battle Creek Sanitarium for medical treatment many times. On one occasion, near the end of her life, she has a skin ulcer. And Kellogg is so concerned with trying to save her life that he will cut off a portion of his own skin, and he will graft his white skin onto her own body to try to save her life. It prolonged her life some, and the newspapers report that Adventists had, quote, lengthened her days. But it wasn't enough to save her from death. She was very old anyways, and so she will end up dying. During her last sickness, Kellogg and his medical team are continually caring for Sojourner Truth on a daily basis. They're visiting her in her home. And after her death, the sanitarium will proudly display this famous painting of Sojourner Truth meeting President Abraham Lincoln. Now, tragically, this is the only version of that image that has survived, because when the Battle Creek Sanitarium burned in the fire, this painting was consumed. But fortunately, it was photographed. Only in black and white, though. We don't know what it looked like in color, but it was photographed before that fire. And so we have an image of it still. We can have some idea of what that painting looked like. So this hung at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, the very famous painting. Numerous Adventist residents in Battle Creek later claimed that Sojourner Truth regularly attended the Dime Tabernacle. She did frequently. How often, we don't know. It's doubtful, as one local historian has claimed that it was done for more than a quarter of a century. I highly doubt that was the case, but I do think that it increasingly happened in the late 1870s and early 1880s. The strongest evidence for this is coming from this man here, James Hannibal Lewis, who was a Black Adventist barber in Battle Creek, and he had lived in Battle Creek for more than 60 years. In the mid-1950s, a long time after, we're talking about 70 years or so after Sojourner Truth dies, James E. Dykes, who is in the center of this image, he's a writer for Message Magazine. He spends 2 years interviewing people in Battle Creek who had known Sojourner Truth, and he interviews Lewis at that time. Now in his late 80s or early 90s, Lewis stated this. He said, quote, "I recall that Sojourner Truth was baptized by Uriah Smith in the Kalamazoo River at the end of Cash Street, end quote. However, it's understandable that that many, including some historians have doubted the accuracy of this account because there's no contemporary evidence that we know of. The newspapers don't talk about it. It's not mentioned in the Adventist periodicals. So we have a lot of questions. If Uriah Smith did baptize Sojourner Truth, why wasn't it stated somewhere? We don't know. But being a crazy kind of person I am, I said, let's see what the evidence looks like. Let's sort of see how reliable this witness was. So I said, let's take a look. And I found these points which really significantly enhance the likelihood of that testimony that we shared about Uriah Smith baptizing her. Number one, as Lewis B. Reynolds has stated long ago in his History of Black Adventism, we know that members of the Gage, Smith, Price, and Paulson families, all families living in Battle Creek, they all confirmed Lewis's account, asserting that she was a good Adventist. They all believed that she was. If Uriah Smith baptized Truth, then would also explain a funeral switch question that I'm about to tell you in a second, okay? Because you'll see that in a second. So we'll come back to point 2. We can also confirm that Lewis remembered the correct baptismal location. According to James White, Battle Creek Adventists typically baptized people in the Kalamazoo River, and by 1878, roughly around the time, or maybe a little earlier than Sojourner Truth's baptism would have taken place, more than 1,000 Adventists had been baptized in that spot. So that's where the baptisms were done. We also know, when I published this article over like a year and a half ago, Jim Nix, who you might know the name, he said, I'm not convinced, Kevin. I'm not convinced by your argument about Sojourner Truth. Uriah Smith had only one leg. How could he baptize anybody? And I said, okay, that's a good point. And I started to look to see if I could find evidence that Uriah Smith ever baptized other people since he was handicapped. And we know that he did sometimes, rarely, but there is one person who before they died, they said, I was baptized by Uriah Smith. So he sometimes did baptize people. We also can document that James Hannibal Lewis lived in Battle Creek about the time Sojourner Truth would have been baptized. He was a teenager and like 17 or 18, so not a kid, a young adult. And he attended Battle Creek College at that time in the early 1880s. So he was there. He would have witnessed this himself. This is not just some sort of other random thing. And we can also show, and I do in an article I published in the Lake Union Herald in January of last year, we can also show that Lewis did not wait until the late 1950s or mid-1950s to share this information with Adventists. He and his wife started the tradition of leading Adventist people to the Battle Creek cemetery, where James and Ellen White are buried and many other pioneers are buried, and they started leading tours to Sojourner Truth's grave, and they were telling the Adventist visitors that she was an Adventist. So they've been telling people this for decades and decades and decades. So let's come back to the funeral switch question. Here's this interesting, curious thing. Truth dies in her home in Battle Creek, Michigan, in the early morning of November 26, 1883. Later on that same day, the Battle Creek Moon, that's a newspaper there, they announced, quote, the funeral will be held at the Tabernacle, Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, Elder Uriah Smith officiating. Now that's a reference to the Dime Tabernacle. And this is a reliable account because this reporter had just visited Sojourner Truth on her deathbed a day or two before this. So he would have got this information from Sojourner Truth herself or the people attending her. So it seems quite clear that Uriah Smith was originally asked to officiate her funeral in the Adventist church there. But it didn't happen. There was a funeral switch. Okay? Despite the announcement, the editor of the Battle Creek Daily Journal on that same day revealed that there was some question about the arrangement of Sojourner Truth's funeral. Also, right on the day of his death, this editor affirmed that the funeral would take place on Wednesday, November 28, but stated that, quote, the place and hour will be announced tomorrow. Well, if it was certain and settled, why didn't he just say it was in the tabernacle with Uriah Smith? Well, the next day, Battle Creek residents learned that the location of the officiant had changed. The funeral would now be held in, quote, the Congregational and Presbyterian Church, the Reverend Reed Stewart officiating. And you can see a copy of the newspapers here. The top one here, the funeral will be held at the tabernacle with Uriah Smith officiating. And then down below here, the new location announced the next day.